Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this panel that is called What are the causes of distrust in democracies in the context of digital age? First of all, it's an honor for me to be the chair of this panel, and I thank all the members of the panel. Thank you for all the effort to come here. Some ones that just come for a quick moment to New York. And I think this panel is very, very important because probably is one of the main topics that now are facing democracies and are facing the legal systems around the world. And as many things that happen with technology is going much faster than the legal solutions, so that there are many problems at the same time that have to do with the relationship with human beings, with governments, with the big tech companies, of course, and the private actors. And the role of the state is fundamental because it probably has been challenged in many ways because of the lack of law and the lack of many precedents that we need, like in the legal system, in the legislative system, to face these new threats that are merging in our societies. So I would like to stop here. I would like to leave the panel to the guests, and at the end I will conclude with some reflections. So in the order we have, I give the word like for 7 minutes, if it's okay, and then we'll leave a brief moment so that we can answer some questions, if there are some questions, to Antonio Villaraigosa. Antonio, it's a pleasure to have you in the floor. He was the 41 Mayor of LA, Los Angeles, from 2005 to 2013. And also he is a very known politician in the Hispanic community in the US, and also it's a very good friend of Mexico. He's third generation of Mexicans in the US, and of course he has a much bigger CV, but I'll leave it here so that he could please take the floor. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for agreeing to chair this conversation, Magistrado. It's an honor to be here with you, a paisano. When I saw your name, I felt a lot better, except that we're going to do this in English, not in Spanish. And when you're third generation like me and you didn't speak Spanish in the home, but learned to, defending immigrants, I struggle with it, but I always like to practice. So thank you. And it's good to be here with the World Juris Congress for a second time. I was in Barranquilla about 2 years ago, and I think it's a very important effort on the part of the World Juris Congress to bring experts. By the way, I'm a former politician, as was mentioned, so I'm the only non-expert here, but certainly I've had a relationship to campaigns, to the impact of social media on those campaigns, and as someone living in the United States, know full well how those platforms can be misused and the like. And I think specifically misused for the spread of misinformation. What happens is the sharing of online information has made it possible for the rapid spread of misleading information, which can undermine the integrity of the democratic process. And in addition to that, issue of privacy and surveillance. The digital age has seen an unprecedented collection and analysis of personal data, often without individual knowledge of consent. Governments and corporations have can and have exploited this data to monitor citizens, track their activities, and potentially influence their political behavior. The digital divide. Not everybody has a computer or access to one. And so not everyone has the equal access to digital technologies and the internet, creating a divide between the haves and the have-nots and deepening social and economic inequalities. It can limit individuals' participation in the democratic process, as I mentioned, and potentially marginalize them. Online echo chambers. I don't have to tell you what's particularly disturbing about social media is that false information, which gets spread so easily, is also through algorithms and the like on the part of the social media, really intensified and repeated again and again, and particularly with people with less education and less understanding, oftentimes believe all of this, and we saw that with QAnon in the United States and all of the propaganda that they were putting forth, and many people really buying into, whether it was vaccines, whether it was COVID, whatever the issue was. That echo chamber has, created an aberration in our democracy. Cybersecurity and election interference. The digital age has brought about new vulnerabilities in our electoral system, and cyber attacks, in the United States, but all over the world. But we've seen, and I'll speak to later, what foreign interference can do to undermine the integrity of elections and the democratic process as a whole. Promoting against these threats and ensuring the security of the digital infrastructure become a significant concern for democracy. Online harassment and manipulation. If you're an elected, I can tell you, you take a position and you have people so angry that they engage in death threats. They try to intimidate you. They tell you where you live, who your children are. They come at you in a way to undermine free speech, to promote and troll hate speech. And these campaigns are just that. They're coordinated. They don't, it's not just individual actors. Oftentimes, they engage in a cyberbullying that I think is really a threat to our democracy. Digital governance and accountability. In the United States, we believe in free speech, and that's true for many democracies around the world. We have, and I'm the former president of the ACLU of Southern California in the 90s and in the 80s. I can tell you, I believe in the First Amendment, but we can be very doctrinaire with respect to First Amendment issues and government interference. And it's gotten to the point that, some have argued that when you use the N-word or engage in this kind of harassment, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, that monitoring or policing it is antithetical to the First Amendment. And as someone who's been involved with the First Amendment most of a good part of his life, I can tell you that this notion of slippery slope is just that. You can put in safeguards to protect against it. How much do I have? One more minute? Or
3 more.
3 more. Oh, okay, so I'm good. It's going too fast. I wanted to make sure. Just real quickly, if I have 3 minutes, in the U.S., because as I said, I'm the only non-expert here, but as a former politician, and social media came, I've been involved, it was before I was mayor. I was Speaker of the California State Assembly, Majority Leader for years, so I've been involved for 30 years. In the beginning, we didn't really have most of this. It didn't come until really once I got elected to the mayor's office in 2005. And at the time, we didn't see all of what we've seen that really went on steroids in the prelude to Trump's election, and now nationally to a much greater degree. But as I mentioned, election interference has been specific to the United States, and not just Russian actors. There have been at least 3 other national actors who have tried to involve themselves in our elections, spreading disinformation, spreading polarization by really through bots and other activities, really kind of spreading this notion of division in the country. The threat of this, interference in the digital age has been profound. I love when I go to other countries and they say the United States doesn't have to worry. We have the strongest democratic institutions. Well, we saw under President Trump what a strong man can do, and I don't mean strong man, I'm saying strong man in the political sense, what a strong man could do to undermine those institutions, whether it's the courts, whether it's the Congress, whether it's the media. And you see that in Mexico currently. You see it in countries around the world where strongmen are taking over and undermining those institutions. I believe that we need to have more collaborative efforts between government agencies and companies and the intelligence community to detect and respond to election meddling. Enhanced cooperation with international partners is crucial to address the global issues of election interference, and educating voters from an early age about foreign actors promoting. We should be promoting much more media literacy as well. Tell me when I'm getting close. Social media and polarization, I think I already spoke to it. You've really seen it in the United States. For those of us, and I'm a history major who have studied history, I can tell you this, that we have never been this divided, probably since the Civil War. And you're seeing with the proliferation of guns and assault weapons, that Civil War could be closer than not. But my time's up, and I'll respond. I want to respond to my chairman.
Thank you, Antonio. Now in the order of participation, we have Katherine Ellena. Katherine, she is Vice President of International Foundation for Electoral Systems, IFES, and she is an expert
My
in
iPad was,
many
it ran out, so I have to use this.
electoral
Maybe it's
topics,
even easier.
especially in regions that are like in development of democracy. So thank you, Katherine, for coming from Washington, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Justice Vargas, my very good friend, and thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm actually very excited to have a panel that's got a politician, a technologist, a judge, and other experts. So it's a pleasure for me to be here today. For those of you who are not familiar with IFES, the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, we are a non-profit, non-partisan, non-government organization that essentially provides technical assistance around the world, specifically on electoral processes. So my background is as a lawyer, but I have a 12-year-old and an 18-year-old, so I've had a postgraduate education in social media platforms that way. So a really important topic that we're tackling today, and thinking about coming into this panel, I wanted to make maybe 4 key points or raise 4 key challenges as to where we are right now in this moment in time, and then put forward perhaps just a few suggestions of what we can actually do, because it's very easy in these discussions to, I think, become overwhelmed by the scope of the challenge that we're facing. So the first point, I think, and it has already been made, is, but I think it bears repeating constantly, things are constantly changing rapidly. So, they're changing as we're sitting here and speaking. They have changed significantly since January, for example, with technology. And so just the pace of change that we're seeing and how to react to that is a challenge. I think we've seen just this year significant retrenchment amongst or from the legacy social media platforms and tech giants, partly due to economic pressures, I think, in Silicon Valley, And they are, of course, then reducing their investments in things like content moderation. They're rethinking the categories of free speech speech that they might moderate. I think rethinking their engagement around the world with electoral management bodies. So that has happened, I think, fairly rapidly in recent times. At the same time, we've got these proliferation of new platforms, Blue Sky, Mastodon, TikTok, Be Real, Twitch. That's the postgraduate education I think we all need. These new platforms haven't necessarily gone through the process that these bigger, older ones have of thinking through the implications for democracy that their services or products may have. And they have different models. For example, Mastodon is all community run. So when you have a platform that's community run, how do you tackle issues of trust and safety in a democracy? Also seeing very rapid shifts in usage patterns, particularly amongst youth. You know, they can shift very quickly from one platform potentially to another, and that can have significant implications, I think, in electoral and political participation. We have the rapid build-up of 5G infrastructure. And then, of course, artificial intelligence has kind of burst into the public consciousness literally this year, and I'll be interested to hear others on this panel with more experience on that talk about it. But I think we're still in a little bit of a wait-and-see posture with AI. I think it's very easy to quickly go to the doomsday scenario, potentially, of what AI can be doing, particularly in elections and electoral integrity. Are we going to see deepfakes everywhere in every part of the electoral process? Possibly, but I think we need to be able to focus on the most critical issues. So, one significant AI deepfake or a particular issue, if it happens at the wrong time in an election, it can really have such a significant impact. And then I'm sure my colleague will talk about algorithms and AI, and we're already seeing, certainly in the US and other places, AI being used in the electoral process, cleaning voter records, verifying signatures or mail-in ballots, drawing district lines. So what are the potential algorithm biases or harms coming up there? So that's kind of first challenge right now, everything rapidly changing. Second, this continued escalation of cyber warfare and commercialization of cyber attacks or online forms of influence. I think we see two sort of faces to that. One's the kind of big state-sanctioned cyber warfare across borders. You're seeing that in Ukraine, but certainly in the ally countries around Ukraine, Poland, Moldova, Lithuania. And I think that kind of cyber warfare, we're going to see that in all conflicts going forward, and that's a specific new shared threat, essentially. But then you've got this second low-cost commercialized disinformation. And one of the interesting cases that jumps out at me is actually recently in Venezuela and then Burkina Faso, where the same AI technology, a company called Synthesia that developed AI avatars, very cheaply available on the internet. You can plug in the script that you want the avatar to talk about, and then utilize that, and it can spread very quickly. So the same technology was used in Venezuela to sort of bolster the regime. And then on the other side of the world, exactly the same thing, but a very just different script, basically, focused on the coup in Burkina Faso. So that type of dispersed, sort of commercialized, but fairly cheap vectors for disinformation, I think, a real challenge. Two, just very quick other challenges. One, the introduction and experimentation around election technology. Sometimes that technology is being introduced deliberately in the law. That was the case in Kenya. Sometimes it's being introduced somewhere, but the legal framework does not match that technology well, and then it's ending up in the courts and being a challenge. Those new technologies can fail for a lot of reasons. or they can be deployed effectively but become a vector for disinformation, regardless of how effective they may be. So lastly, I think the key challenge is that this community, the elections, democracy, legal community, already was not keeping up with the threats and the challenges, I think, to democratic elections. When you add on top all of these new threats and challenges, and particularly the pace in which they're happening, you could have all the resources in the world, and I think, to defend democratic elections, but still be behind, in part because you're not playing by the same rules, potentially, of those who are utilizing some of these threat vectors. And then, of course, because legal and regulatory frameworks usually lag far behind, as Justice Vargas said, I think judges are now playing this fundamental role where there's such lacuna in the law, yet these fast-paced challenges that are coming, and we're seeing, of course, these elections ending up in the courts. So just to finish on, in 1 minute, what to actually do about this. As I said, when we think about it, I think it feels overwhelming. IFAS tends to work a lot with election management bodies, but also with legislators and judiciary, and I think there are different key things to be done here. The first, particularly for election managers and judges, is preserving your autonomy. What we see with election management bodies, when they're overwhelmed with a technology or cyber issue, you may bring in law enforcement or intel or provide some access to your system, but you have to protect your autonomy when you are doing that, because it can go away very quickly and be very difficult to get back. And I think that's similar for the courts. Finding trusted advisors. I think there's plenty of advisors out there who may be sort of selling something at the same time as providing you advice on electoral technology and security. So those trusted advisors, I think, are incredibly important. And thirdly, I'd say those advisors can help institutions avoid the hype cycle. I think we're currently seeing kind of a hype cycle around AI. Getting a sort of neutral technical advisor, what aspect of AI do I most need to direct my resources toward and care about? And then last few things, I think a very localized approach where possible. I think, again, there's lots of global algorithms, platforms, large tech firms that maybe come with solutions, but election administrators need to focus very carefully, I think, on the unique legal procedural situation that they have. Looking at election technology holistically, it's not just the different platforms that you run in an election, it's your website, it's your Facebook. Those are often the primary things to be tackled. And then lastly, because I'm at time, I think specifically for courts, given we're here with this Juris Congress, and Justice Vargas and I have discussed this a lot, I think judges need to be prepared to deliberate on these issues of technology, and I think be able to understand the technology that may be coming down the line into the court. May need to adapt rules of procedure to bring in technical experts to be able to inform on specific issues. So I could go on for a long time, but I will pause there and look forward to other comments from the rest of the panel.
Thank you very much, Katherine. And in the order, I give the floor to Srdjan Darmanovic. Mrs. Darmanovic is a former Minister of Foreign Affairs, and at the moment from Montegro, and at the moment he's a member of the Venice Commission. Actually, he presides the Council of Democratic Elections at the Venice Commission, and also now he's a professor at Washington. He will tell us more. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, José Luis. We have recently had the International Congress in Mexico City about similar topic, beautifully organized by the Tribunal and in a cooperation with the Venice Commission. And I've been speaking there mostly on democracy threats, including digital technologies. But today, I will speak something more about democracy resilience, in spite of the use and misuse of digital technology. Maybe it is also because I believe that I'm the only non-lawyer among you. I'm the political scientist. And maybe it's something that it occupies me a lot. We all know that maybe the whole decade we are speaking, political scientists and other political thinkers are speaking about a phenomenon of our time that someone calls democracy backsliding. The others are speaking about democracy recession. And many journalists are just speaking about crisis of democracy, democracy crisis. Also, it very much came to into the memory came the possibility of democracy breakdown when we are speaking in these terms, or de facto the collapse. So our question is it really the case? Because many events in the last decade are speaking about this. Sometimes around 2014, 2016, many events happened. Russian occupation of Crimea, Xi Jinping's tightening grip of power in China, Erdogan's exploitation of a clumsy July 2016 coup for the sweeping crackdown on opposition, academia, media, civil society, Brexit in the UK, Trump victory in 2016. Many events indicated that we may be ushered in some different era, or at least found ourselves in very enchanted waters. The known magazines around the world printed in their cover page titles like Rise of the Strongman with Putin on the cover page, surrounded by Erdogan, Viktor Orban, Duterte, and so on. Is democracy dying? The bad guys are winning, and so on and so on. Of course, this whole trend culminated on February 24th last year, when a nuclear power invaded its immediate neighbor, or what is more important for our topic, one of two largest autocracies in the world took off the gloves of hybrid warfare and attacked a democracy in the neighborhood with the real and brute physical force, from the ground, sea, and from the air. Statistical data also support these narrative on democracy crisis or backsliding, because more countries in the world from 2012 to today were autocratized than democratized. But I would also want to bring your attention of something else, and to shift a bit of quite understandable fascination with the digital technologies and their relation with democracy. I would like actually to emphasize some sources of resilience of democracy, regardless of use or misuse of the digital technologies. First of all, we should have always in our mind Simon Martin Lipset and his prediction that socioeconomic structures and conditions very much influence the level of democracy. What Adam Przeworski actually confirmed sometimes around 2000 or something before, with his finding that no democracy has ever been subverted in a country with per capita income higher than of Argentina in 1975. With one exception, it's Turkey in our time, and I would maybe add Hungary, where, by the words of their own prime minister, Hungary is no more a liberal democracy but illiberal democracy, as Viktor Orban likes to say. But along with Turkish and Hungarian exceptions, the Przeworski rule is still standing on a solid ground. It is very unlikely to expect that affluent democracies, in which national wealth derives not from unproductive rents like oil revenue states, but of the productive industries, it's very unlikely to them to be subverted for authoritarian regimes. Statistically, chances of survival of democracies in the countries with only $5,000 GDP per capita are 60%, with $10,000, 75%, and with 20,000 up high to 97%, almost virtually untouchable. Most of the countries in the Western Balkan region where I live, I'm from Montenegro, go between $6,000 and $10,000 GDP per capita. Factual situation there actually support the predictions. Our democracies are not untouchable. Most of them are just electoral democracies with troubled rule of law, what means that no one reached the level of liberal democracies. But leaders come and go by elections. And in the surveys, citizens don't support any alternative to democratic regimes. Survey by survey. Exception at the moment is only Serbia, where electoral autocracy has been developed under President Vučić. But in these days, under serious challenge by mass protests in Belgrade and elsewhere. Democracy today is rarely threatened by generals, but in most cases of the elected officials. But even then, stay away of overt autogolpes, as it was the case in Marcos and Fujimori style. They hold regular elections, keep legislators open, allow opposition to function, at least to a certain degree, but usurp or capture institutions. For example, to make Nicaragua authoritarian state, elections served Daniel Ortega much better than his revolution decades ago. Nevertheless, multipartism, even under assault of would-be autocrats, is a self-defending mechanism. Today, all these authoritarian leaders have to go through election process, have to somehow build coalitions, and at the end of the day, they often lose. Of course, some of them still manage to win, like Erdogan or Orban, but as Carothers wrote in 2018, competitive authoritarianism, even if lasts relatively long, tend to be rather temporary situation, transforming to democracy or falling to autocratic regimes. Of original 35 competitive authoritarian regimes in the world, around half moved to electoral democracy, while only Russia, Belarus, Nicaragua, Cambodia, Cameroon, and Gabon established de facto one-party rule under individual dictator. Of course, there are much more autocratic regimes throughout the globe, where China is by far most important one. But China is not the result of democratic breakdown, as this country have never been democracy in its history. So our topic might be, is every backsliding leading to a breakdown? I would say that backsliding is much more a problem within electoral democracies, but it does not necessarily lead to the breakdown. Cases of Rafael Correa in Ecuador, Duterte in the Philippines, Mečiar in Slovakia, Janša in Slovenia, or if you want, Donald Trump in this country, testify that these would-be autocrats have never been able to transform their political agenda into the real authoritarian regime. On the contrary, they had been ejected by the electorate, defeated in the polling stations, typical and core institutions of democracy. So the action is to always defend democracy as stronger as possible, under assault. Even if long in power, autocrats or would-be autocrats are always be challenged. Finally, we have one very strong geopolitical fact in our time. It is Russian-Ukrainian war. You might not agree with me, but I'm pretty much sure that Russia is losing the war in one or another way. Nobody will take Moscow, of course. But I strongly believe they will be defeated in the Ukrainian soil. It will be a big blow to the authoritarian, let's say, international in the world. Because that kind of a regime after losing the war, or having to accept kind of a peace that they are not satisfied with, will be weak. After all, who on earth could have predicted that one actually criminal that was in prison will challenge the Putin's regime in so blatant way as we saw with Prigozhin? So I believe that ultimately, Sir Winston Churchill's words, the democracy is actually awful regime, but still much better than all others tried alternatively, is still very much at place. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Too
Srdjan.
optimistic?
Now, I'm going to give the floor to Gemma Galdon-Clavell.
Based on what we've seen, but I
Gemma
don't know that
es
it stays that way.
fundadora y CEO of Etics. Please take the floor.
Thank you. I'm going to change the approach a little bit. I'm not going to talk about wars. I'm not going to talk about elections. I'm going to talk about democracy, though, and democracy and technology. And let me start with a couple of examples. Did you know that are not technology and not democracy, apparently? Did you know that in the 19th century, you could buy cocaine in pharmacies? You could. Just walked into a pharmacy, get cocaine, because it was thought to help with headaches. It did help with headaches, also with other things. If we had had COVID in the 19th century, we probably would have tested the vaccines on people. We would have taken dark-skinned people, poor people, and sacrificed them to see if the vaccines worked. You know how we changed that? Through democracy. Democracy is about protecting people. The main thing that democracy does is protect us all, create mechanisms of oversight so that anything that we use has been validated as safe for us to use. That's why right now, if someone wants to sell cocaine at a pharmacy, they can't, because there's something in the process that stops them from hitting the pharmacy or any other space. Anything around us has been regulated. The chairs that you are sitting on have had to prove that the materials used have been sourced legally and that they can hold the weight of a person. And the worst thing that can happen if your chair malfunctions is that you fall off the chair. But still, we protect people. And anything that hits us as consumers, as citizens, goes through a process of oversight. What I saw a long time ago, I started Eticas 11 years ago, is that when it comes to tech, democracy is failing us. Democracy is not able to create the mechanisms that ensure that tech products, when they get to us, when they use our data, when they intervene in processes that affect us, democracy has been unable to create the mechanisms that protect us. And so I started an organization to protect people in technology processes. I started it 11 years ago. Excuse me. I listened to your contribution. I'd like if you could listen to mine. Thank you.
It was not delivered.
It's fine. Initially as a nonprofit, and we're now preparing our Series A and hoping to grow big through doing algorithmic auditing. We audit AI systems to ensure that they work well, that what they do is what they're supposed to do, and that we are protecting people in that process. So our mission continues to be to protect people in technology processes. Because what we see when we audit AI systems today, for instance, is that when women go to a bank, we receive between 10 and 20 times less services than men just because we are underrepresented in the training data. So a technical issue that no one has fixed means that we are discriminated against systematically when we go to a bank as women, just for being women, just because the system sees us as women and less desirable as clients, because in the past, the typical client has been a man. We audit facial recognition systems. We are working together with people with Down syndrome to see how a facial recognition system impacts them. We are all assuming that facial recognition is going to be the gateway to everything, to unlock our phone, to enter a country. Well, what we're seeing with people with Down syndrome is that facial recognition keeps seeing them as children. So any system that requires that you are above 18 or 21 will be, people with Down syndrome will be stopped. And it's not just people with Down syndrome. Anyone without a typical face will suffer the consequences of systems that don't work well with them. When we audit systems, that's exactly what we do. We identify when those systems are failing, when those systems are impacting on specific populations in ways that are unfair, and we fix it. Because that's the great news. We can fix that. We can ensure that women are treated fairly when they go to a bank. We can ensure that people with Down syndrome are treated fairly when they use facial recognition. But someone that needs to do that job. And right now, no one's doing it. The same with social media. We know that social media manipulates, creates addiction. It's a space for massive disinformation. We can solve that. But we just need someone to care about that. I often use an example that I think is fairly graphic. If you want to build a building, you need plumbers. And it's great if you have the best plumber. But just with plumbers, you cannot build a building. If you want to build something complex that needs to hold people and not fall on them, you need plumbers, but you also need electricians, you need painters, you need architects, you need a lot of people. And people who can talk to one another. We are building the digital age with plumbers alone. That's the engineers. They can be the best engineers, but unless they know how to talk to others, people that come from with lawyers, people that come from the sociology of law, people who understand the world, with sociologists, with philosophers. Unless we have those teams, we will not be able to see the problems that those systems are capturing and often reproducing. Our solution to all that is algorithmic auditing. It's a specific mechanism that we have already used in other spaces, in other industries, to ensure that systems, digital systems that are deployed around us, do what they say and say what they do. We need to stop the broken debate that we have right now between engineers and lawyers, sociologists, and people from the social sciences. Because what happens when that conversation is broken is that we end up with e-voting machines that don't work. If you ask us, we are in the middle, so we have the technical knowledge, but also the social science knowledge. If you ask us, we can very easily tell you, are e-voting systems safe? Well, it depends. Is anonymity important? If anonymity is important, we cannot create a robust system. It's as easy as that. The safety of a system depends on the threat model. So if you want to keep the data of the people who vote, if you don't want to know that John Doe voted for whatever candidate, if that is important, not knowing who voted for whom, we cannot create a technical system today that guarantees anonymity. If you want it to be robust, it cannot be anonymous. If you want it to be anonymous, it cannot be robust. So I would say right now, use e-voting machines. If you are voting something in your school or something that no one's going to try to break your system. But these are things that you only see when you combine technical knowledge with the knowledge of the context of the implementation of the technologies. With auditing, we bring this context into the development of the systems. And everyone was talking, I'm going to finish with this, everyone was talking about where they come from, what they've done. I'm a proud European based here. I'm a first generation migrant. And I am fulfilling the American dream because I came here and pretty much immediately Silicon Valley knocked on my door saying, we think that what you're doing has value. We want to invest in you. And so I think that even Silicon Valley and the more tech bros convinced that technology can save the world are realizing that the future is about responsible tech. It's not just tech anymore, it's responsible tech. And democracies need to step it up and need to understand that if democracy is about protecting people, that means protecting people also in digital spaces. And that means creating the oversight mechanisms and the inspection mechanisms that will ensure that when a technical digital system hits us, is put at our disposal, it has gone through a mechanism of oversight that ensures that it is safe for us, for our children, for our elders to use. Right now, that is not the case, and that needs to change fast if we want to continue to call ourselves democracies. And I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Gemma. You were amazing with your time. And now I give the floor to Fabio Bertoni. He is General Counsel at the New York. Please, Fabio, the floor is yours.
Hi, and thank you for having me on this panel. My concern professionally and personally is with attacks on journalists. I'm an American First Amendment lawyer, so my perspective is American law, but I think it's a truism to say that journalism and free speech is essential to democracy, right? You can't have legitimate democracy without a free press. There's a professor, Bert Newborn, who has a theory that the structure of the First Amendment in the U.S. Constitution actually tracks it's not accidental that it says that there's freedom of religion, freedom of speech and of the press, and of assembly, and to petition government, right? So Professor Newborn's theory is that that's an arc. That's an arc of freedom of expression that begins with the personal, my religious convictions and my thoughts, then transitions to discussion and printing and publishing of your ideas, with the end result being the right to petition government for redress of grievances, right? So in order to get to what we all conceive of as democracy, the ability to petition government and to be heard, we need those other elements of freedom of speech. So journalism is a core part of that, right? And so what I am concerned about are threats to journalism, and specifically on this panel, digital related threats to journalism. I don't have great solutions to these problems, so I'm sorry for that. But the first threat I think that is pressing is physical threats to journalists, and those are both personal threats. Attacks on journalism, 2022 was, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, the highest. It was dramatically higher than 2021 in terms of physical attacks on journalism. Some of that has to do with the Ukraine war. There were a number of journalists who were killed in the early days of the Ukraine war. But generally, globally, we see increasing physical attacks on journalists. I think some of that is prompted by social media, and if you have enough people making threats on social media about attacking journalists, eventually someone's going to do it. So that's the first concern I have. That it's not just physical attacks, though; it's also digital attacks. So we've written about, Ronan Farrow, one of our writers, has written about technology that governments use to track journalists and then to attack journalists. So there's software called Pegasus that can be surreptitiously installed on people's phones. It can turn their phones on remotely. It can download information from their phones, their contacts, and this is being used by repressive governments to track journalists who are reporting on them and harass them and sometimes kill them. So that is a use of technology. Reporters can rarely do their jobs without using technology, but it's a weaponization of it. The second concern I have, the second attack on journalism, is the economic attacks on journalism. These are sort of economic forces that have been pending for a long time. They're nothing new, but they've become really serious in the digital age. So the first big hit to journalism was loss of advertising. A lot of newspapers and magazines depended on classified advertising. With the dawn of the internet, a lot of classified advertising just went away, right? People started advertising their jobs and other things online, and newspapers and magazines lost a lot of advertising. That has progressed apace, right? And these days, I know a lot of websites, a lot of publications get the bulk of their traffic not through their homepage, right? People don't go to New Yorker. Some people do. Old people like me do, but many people don't go through the homepage of a publication. They either see an article posted on Facebook or one of the social media accounts, Twitter, and that's how they enter into the website, and that's what drives the viewership. Facebook is pulling back on its promotion of news papers and journalism, and that's hurting the revenue of journalistic outlets. in a way that, we've seen the closing of a lot of local news outlets. The loss of local news clearly is a huge threat to journalism. And the final concern that I have before I run out of time is social and cultural threats to the idea of journalism, right? We have another writer, Masha Gessen, who made a point that the purpose of of lies in authoritarian regimes, she's Russian, the purpose of the lies that the regime, the government promotes and distributes through its own internal press outlets is not necessarily to convince the people of the truth of those lies. Everybody knows that when the government is lying. The effect of it really is to eliminate any hope of ever knowing the truth. And I think that's what we are on the brink of as a society, where people have lost or are starting to lose a sense of the possibility of knowing the truth, right? Everything is in doubt. And it's not necessarily, although there are people who believe in QAnon and other kinds of crazy, false information that's spread through social media and otherwise, I think that in some ways the bigger risk is that a bulk of people know that QAnon is false, but they don't know what's true. And it's hard to determine what is the truth. And a magazine like ours that is very rigorous in its reporting and fact-checking, has a hard time piercing that mistrust from the general population. And once, people start to doubt the truth of anything they see or read, and this is also AI has a role in this and increases the risk of fake news and fake video and fake photographs that are difficult to determine whether they're accurate or not, and is only going to get more concentrated. That is a real risk to society, I think, if we can't agree on established facts, established truth, and that has traditionally been the role of journalism, and I think that's under real threat. I agree with the mayor that education for students in media literacy, in democracy, in civics is critically important. But I worry that we don't necessarily have the time to wait for the upcoming generations to. We may be losing things now. So that's my doomsday scenario speech.
Thank you very much, Fabio. And again, we appreciate that you respected your time. And now, to end this panel, I'll give the floor to Orlando Miera Blanco. He is a lawyer, politician, professor of political science. And also he is a former ambassador in Canada of the movement of, please explain, thank you.
Thank you. As you say, last but not least, so let's talk a little bit about what's going on in Venezuela. It's inevitable, but because in Venezuela, I'm just happy because Minister Srdjan did not mention about what's going to happen in Venezuela in order to share with you that I call digital holocaust in our country. So we have a huge blackout in Venezuela about freedom of speech, mostly of the website that we have in Venezuela in which are opposite to the regime, had been just blackout, all the IPs. So in order to try to hide our voices in the world from Venezuela, right now, by the way, by contradiction, the only way is by digital way outside Venezuela. In my own case, it's true, I was a former ambassador of the interim government of Juan Guaidó in Canada for almost 4 years and something. But even I have been writing for more than 30 years, and I have a TV show even in Miami. So it's no way that my articles go into Venezuela easily. So just talking about freedom of speech and how it's a huge contradiction, how the regime handled the propaganda with digital manner, how they create fake news, fake scenarios, and at the end it's a huge manipulation that we have in the country, at the point that now in Venezuela, if you're asking why, for example, 65% of the population they are not interested about politics, it's because of blackout. There's no way to obtain objective information about what's going on. But on the other hand, if you're asking my colleagues, even diplomats, even lawyers around the world, if they know that in Venezuela we have 25% of the population starving, 11 million, nobody knows that. We have worse statistics in Venezuela than in Ukraine in terms of violence, in terms of people dying because starving, in terms of freedom, in terms of children. Just yesterday, a woman, 14 years old, Venezuelan, trying to cross the border between Panama and Colombia, she had been raped for 67 times. And his mother and his father just died. Yes, robbed. Rape. Yes, have been violated.
Oh, raped.
Rape. So how we can use the digital world in order to complain and to denounce this situation? How we can overcome the censor in order to share that situation with institution, democracy. The golden rule of democracy, by the way, is election, talking about another issue. But if we have a lot of interference in the election, we have to forget about democracy. In Venezuela, we have a huge manipulation about the digital data. We have a permanent voter registration inflated at least in 20-25%. We have a huge amount of people who die and vote in Venezuela. We have a lot of people which coming from Cuba, from Iran, with Venezuelan passport, and they vote in Venezuela. And we have no way to try to correct this situation in our country. When you're talking about election in Venezuela, we have to deal with this kind of manipulation. But it's not just about the digital data and the manipulation of the whole system, which is automatic. It's about the manipulation of the fake news. It's about how they use the state to bring it out people to vote, how they enforce people to vote by a huge propaganda, and again, by the use of digital platforms, absolutely in favor of the regime. When you live in Canada, one of the main issues in Canada that I learned living in Canada for many years is accountability, is transparency, not just in election, in any way. So it is something that we just lost in Venezuela. So if you want to talk about in Venezuela about democracy, it's not just about dictatorship. It's a huge crime organization who took and assault the state. And it's a huge reflection how we can do under the rule of law in order to try to harmonizing human rights, sovereignty, and the new era of the modernity, how we can go with transparency, how we can go to adapt digital and technology and communication to the service of the appropriate divulgation about what's going on in totalitarianism regime. I'm sorry if I sound a little bit politics in my intervention, but it's inevitable because it's our reality. I rose in a beautiful country. And I wrote and I study and I enjoy justice in Venezuela. I used to be a free man with a free family. And when you lost all the mechanisms of freedom and democracy, when you lost the possibility to express yourself, you just lost part of your identity and your culture. So I'm very proud to be here in order to just to hide my voice, to use this in a good way, in order to help and to push the recovery, not just of freedom and democracy, is the recovery of the right of the people to live in peace, and justice is peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Orlando. Just to close the floor, I would like to give a final reflections about the topic that we are talking today, about the concern of democracy in the digital age. In my opinion, constitutionalism and rule of law cannot be understood without the effectiveness of the law. Artificial intelligence has put on check the legal systems. Technology is not good or bad, it's just technology. But the threats that we are facing because AI is because an absence of prevention in the effects. AI needs to be regulated in the broad way. International cooperation is essential, and here is also the need of new institutions with a new concept of jurisdiction. Societies need to be well educated in AI topics. That includes law enforcement agents and especially the judges. AI providers have a very important role, not just to prevent damages to society by taking responsibility. The state have to bind the AI companies and be able to regulate algorithms, as we regulate many other products as food, drugs, and etc. Political actors, governments, candidates, and political parties need to take responsibility in the use of AI, and if not, we need to create real sanctions. The rights that are involved in AI dilemmas, freedom of expression, privacy, rights of information, as many other rights, need to be balanced and have to be delimited. It's a fact that AI moves very fast, so the challenge is to change the wheel while the car is going on. Thank you very much. And I'll leave the floor, so if you want to make some questions or if you want to make some comments, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. Sorry, I joined halfway. I'm Katherine. I'm a senior lecturer at Legal Tech at Venice University. My question is actually for Gemma, who talked about the responsible technology and some of the importance of discussions, public debates, and value-based framework. If I may add, maybe that's my word, but you need stronger values. And my question is, where do we find those groundings of value? Where do we look at? When we talk about responsibility, transparency, integrity, what do we mean by that? And where do we go with that?
You want to ask someone in specific or? Oh,
Yeah.
answer.
Yeah, I actually think that this doesn't work, right? It works? Oh, okay.
It doesn't sound like it works.
Oh, okay. I actually think we have the values. If you look at general data protection regulation in Europe or the NIST framework for AI in the US, we have the values. The challenge is how do we operationalize the values? And here everyone's stopped. But that's what we do. It's like, and in a space like AI where everything is changing all the time, what we are saying is you have the principles, you have the laws, You have the technical standards, but then you need flexible mechanisms that allows you to inspect the system in its context, and that's the audit. So that's an audit allows you to take the different principles and the laws and the technical standards and be like, what do they mean here for this system that decides who gets a mortgage or decides who gets unemployment? Because that's the kind of the AI systems that we have implemented right now. So basically, it's not so much about the values. I think we've been discussing values for a long time now. It's how do we operationalize that? So when we say transparency, what does it mean? Does it mean the code? Does it mean just a series of information on your system? And in this case, what we are developing are what we call algo scores. Just like when you go to a supermarket and you buy food, it comes with a little table that allows you to compare one product to the other, to know how much sugar it has. So you don't have to be a nutritionist to understand what that food will do to your system. Can we create something similar for AI systems that allow us to make better decisions when we buy those systems out there? So basically, everything that we have out there that protects us and helps us understand as consumers and as citizens how things impact on us, we don't have any of that for AI. So we really need to start running in the development of those specific frameworks that allow us to make better decisions. But so again, I don't think it's about the values. We have the values. Is what do they mean, and how do we make sure that whoever is developing AI is implementing those principles in their work?
Well, first of all, let me just say, I think it's very sweeping to say we have the values. I mean, half this country is divided right now around false information, around IE even, and regulation. So I do agree that some of us have those values. I don't believe that there's enough, and I speak to what the magistrate had to say with respect, I don't believe there's enough governmental regulation with respect to transparency. I do agree with that point. With respect to a number of the things that we've mentioned, I think the government, whether it's AI or the manipulation of information that we see so prevalent in a country that, I mean, most look to as a beacon of democracy, to have seen our institutions so threatened, in no small part because of the misuse of digital platforms, I think, absolutely requires that we have a lot more in the way of regulation, governmental relation, that we start with young people. I used to take my kids to vote with me at every turn. They're not very political today because they saw their father beat up for 35 years, but they vote all the time. They're informed. I think with respect to digital platforms, the issue of false information, really beefing up those values that you spoke to, and in our schools from a very young age, I think is very, very important, because today we're living in silos. We're living in silos, and some of us do have those values, and some of us do believe in truth, and there's a whole group of people all over the world, but I speak about the United States of America, who are living in a bubble and only see the world through that small bubble.
If I may just kind of come back on that. Personally, because working in the space of teaching AI regulation and GDPR back in Europe, I think what is important would be to develop that sense of right and wrong in each individual, that inherent moral compass. I mean, that is what is needed, and that's the basis for my question to the both of you, to all of you. How do we get there? Just regulation, just individual-based approach, or do we think collectively?
Regulation. It'd be really unfair to tell people that road safety is down to them. Of course it's down to them, but we also have cars with seatbelts, and we have speed limits, everything around us. No one's ever telling us it's your responsibility. When you walk into a pharmacy, it's not your responsibility to know whether what you're buying can cure you or not. There's a system that ensures that you are protected. That is missing at the moment. And so that's why we need to make these calls to, we need to educate and all of that. But we also need to speed up our regulatory efforts. But again, it's about the thresholds. Once we start auditing and auditing scales, we'll have the thresholds as to what does truth mean. And what are the thresholds of truth, and what is acceptable and not acceptable? Right now, we don't have that information because we have not asked any of those big tech companies to measure those things. So it's just really hard to regulate when you don't have the measuring. Auditing allows for us to have those measures, to have those thresholds, and then impose them on others and say, this is what is acceptable. These are the error rates that you can afford in this specific context. And of course, the error rates are not the same when you are prioritizing content for Netflix or when you are making a decision about what kind of medical treatment you need. So again, the context is very important. Netflix can afford to suggest the wrong movie to you, but a prioritization system in an emergency room cannot afford to make you wait when you are dying of a heart attack. So context matters, but we need different thresholds for different verticals. That's what we're working on. So I think that there's help in the way, but we really need to speed up those efforts because while we don't have that, people are suffering and people are being victims of really bad decision making made by AI systems.
Sorry, and if I could add, one very important thing that it was mentioned, education. Our kids need to be well educated in AI. That means pedagogy. That means a lot of concepts of what they can do, they cannot do, of values, of how you can surf through the web. I mean, that's very important because nobody is taking care of that, and that's the main probably the point of where starts the threats. So if we are all capable to know how to deal the AI world, that will be much better. So that then could be like much more codes of good practices around the world. Yes, please.
Questions to either Gemma or Srdjan.
Can you talk louder, please?
Sorry?
Can you talk a little
Speak
bit
up.
louder because?
Sorry. My question is either Gemma or Srdjan. I'm originally from Turkey, but I've been living outside my country for many years. I just want to start with Gemma's wonderful analogy of the building and the plumber. Yeah, so builders build the building and choose the workers. So you apply to democracy, journalists, lawyers, legal workers, and so forth. We're all trying to build up our democracy in our countries. But builders are the authoritarian leaders in a way. They build their own way. They choose us. We cannot come together in solidarity. You don't know. You cannot see the whole, but they see the whole and they build their own house in a way. So they will choose us. They win. We don't have connection between us. They have connections between themselves. They are in solidarity. I want to give the example from Turkey. For example, a month ago, there was an election in the country. The current president won the election. And one of the first presidents invited to came was the president of Venezuela. But there's no cultural, religious, and so forth connection with this country. But Maduro was one of the first presidents who came there and then congratulated. And Mr. Orban, again, has been accepted to Turkic nations. There's no still connection between Turkey and Orban. But they are in solidarity and they're in a connection. All builders are in connections, but we are, who try to build up our democracy, are not connected. And it looks like we don't have these resources. So are we losing now? I mean, is there any chance that we can somehow connect resources or leadership and win over the builders?
That's a massive question. All I can say is that without democracy, it's a lot harder. So I guess my main warning, because I was born under a dictatorship, but I grew up in a democratic country, and I live in a democratic country right now, Spain. I was born under Franco. So my fear is that even in democracies, unless we regulate and understand how technology works, we are going to lose battles that we take for granted under democracies. Because rights that have been hardly won in the offline world are not being translated into the online world. And so we are losing rights in democratic countries. In non-democratic countries, it's a lot harder. Because basically you don't have the right builders. You don't have the right people in power who can build the teams that make this all work together. And often they have a vested interest in making the building collapse. So all I can tell you is that in democracies throughout history, we have been very successful at protecting people. So the history of democracy is the history of managing to protect people in all kinds of environments. But if we don't win the democracy battle, I don't really know what to tell you other than I'm really sorry that Turkey is going through that. And I hope that we can do better from now on. But yeah, without democracy, it's hard.
I think one of the that in that analogy that the people don't have connections, but the authoritarian has connections. The connection for people is access to information and journalism. And so, even if it can't happen in the country itself, reporters outside the country reporting on the situation and people and getting that information into the people in the country, which is not always easy to do right now. This is a huge problem in Russia, right? It's illegal to report on the war in certain ways. But having reporters report accurate information and getting that into the country is how you build community among people who understand their shared interests and their shared struggle.
Yeah, just briefly, you're right. Yes. The problem is that the crime moved faster than the rule of law. Organized crimes just move better and efficient than the velocity of the creation of rule of law of the Palermo Convention. Just to give you an example, blockchain. The way how Venezuelan people with Turkish and another ally just trying to evadir, evadir the sanction in Europe or the sanction in the United States is throughout the cryptomoneda. It's throughout this kind of blockchain. And it is a lot of mechanisms that they create by themselves in order to get benefits about technology, to get benefit about this kind of algorithm. So, and the rule of law is trying to figure it out how to be more efficient to attack and to protect the nation about these mechanisms to avoid the sanction. Just to give you an example, what's the benefits of Turkish with Venezuela? Gold, energy, geopolitical allied, that advantage, and the intermediation between Venezuela, Russia, China, Belarus, and Iran. And all of them move in a different technology. So that is my point in order to protect democracy.
Just to add, what you just said is supported in historical examples. Two shining examples are Spanish and Polish transition to democracy, and it was a situation where democratic forces cooperated in almost unique way. In Spain, the bunch of extraordinary individuals, political forces, from the king to the Communist Party, actually united against the party bunker of former Franco's regime. In Poland, even the moderates in the Communist Party cooperated with the solidarity in order to create the better conditions for the democracy. in all the countries, people have to find their way. In Turkey, now it was just the slightest of the margins in the elections decided. No matter how big was the advantage of the Erdogan in the pre-election period. There is a proverb that only fools steal on the election day. And neither Erdogan, it's a very skillful operator. Actually, he created all the conditions before the elections, in the weeks and months before the elections. But still, it was very, very low margin. And it's true they cooperate. The best friend of the Serbian President Vučić is Viktor Orban. They come to every elections to support his party. Every elections. But you know, maybe they cooperate because they know that the regime they created is much more shaky than they believe it. Yeah.
Thank you, Srdjan. We can have a very last question, very quick.
All right, so I'm an attorney from Houston, Texas, a law firm with very large entertainment and First Amendment practice. My question really is with Fabio. How you're from the New Yorker, very respected press. How do you square the First Amendment rights of Fox News, or One America News Network, spreading kind of this information, or what they believe to be true information, short of just government fact checking? I mean, I don't see a way that, besides the market of ideas and kind of letting the public figure out what's true and what's wrong, of making sure that misinformation isn't improperly used.
Yeah, I mean, this is an area where, traditionally we've relied on the tort system, libel lawsuits to repair people's reputation when something is published falsely about them. That's what happened with Fox News and Dominion voting, right? The $787 million award or settlement for Dominion for the false statements about Fox. The problem with the tort system is that it doesn't remedy false information that doesn't, specifically hurt an individual or their reputation. So something like, QAnon theory or COVID, that's never going to be remedied by the tort system. The concern is that some kind of regulation of false speech inhibits free speech too much. So there is a real tension there between freedom of speech and the ability to publish whatever we want to publish, and the ability to limit false speech. I don't have a great answer for it, right? So some kind of system by which, maybe the platforms or other providers, sort of like the Twitter blue check, that this person is who they say they are, is one idea about verifying that this is content that's been verified. This is content that has some factual basis. Twitter has now started doing this where you'll see a tweet and it'll automatically have a question flag beneath it that says this video is actually not what the person is representing it is. It's from an earlier time or something else. That can be useful. I don't know that we want to give all that power to private companies to do that. So I don't think we want to necessarily give the government that power either. So I don't have a great solution for that. But it is something that, collectively through, I think it's ultimately going to depend on having a sophisticated populace that can understand, well, this QAnon theory, it doesn't make any sense. There's no, but again, I don't have a lot of confidence that we have enough time at the speed that things are changing, as Kathleen pointed out, to wait for, the educational benefits to work through the system.
Thank
Well,
you.
I think just real quickly, that fact-checking it should be, on the box, with respect to some of these assertions that you see are made. And I do think smart people who engage in the First Amendment, who have been involved in fighting this, can figure out that, it's not going to be perfect, but what we have now is non-existent. And you can't let the perfect get in the way of the good. This is a threat to our democracy, an assault on our democracy. And we have to be able to try to come up with ways of to address transparency and ways to kind of limit, you know, and even defamation and torts as an example. You know, for guys like me, the Times versus Sullivan is a very high bar to get beyond. And so as much as we want to protect the First Amendment, we can't use the First Amendment to be an excuse to undermine the 14th Amendment and everything else in our Constitution. And that's really where we are today. So smart people coming together, you know, all the stakeholders to try to figure this out is going to be really important, to create an architecture to protect our democracy and truth. Because there is such a thing as truth and falsity. And too much in the way of falsity is entered our body politic and, you know, the discourse, civic discourse that occurs in this country and beyond.
Thank you. I'm afraid we are on time. So I want to thank everyone in this panel for this excellent panel, and thank you very much for all your questions and all the interest in the... Huh?
Yes. Excellent.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you much.